Hi, good morning, everyone. This is the April 8th, 2021 working group of the ordinance regarding short-term rentals. We are reconvening after what is, I think, a full year of this team not being together. So welcome, everybody. I appreciate everybody's time this morning. For the record, I don't think we have to do anything other than open the meeting. Welcome everybody back. So today's meeting is, I think, it was actually, I don't know if it was, I have to give credit to Jackie or to Maria, I forget. But the comments came forward that it was important that the town felt that this team come back together to restart the conversation, because seemingly we all see a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel to our current situation, and that it's quite possible that the movement of people in and out of town for various reasons, and potentially picking up time in what are considered short-term rentals may pick up. I haven't heard of much going on in the off season, so to speak, but it's quite possible. We wanted to get in front of that, and considering that there are always this issue was particularly brought to our attention to put structure around the concept by a concerned group of citizens, which is really, I think, quite often what happens in much of our society, where most of us are not affected by certain things, and we continue to move on through. But some things affect other folks, and then those folks bring it to light, and we have an aha. I go, oh, okay, we got to get into that. We got to check it out and see how it all shakes out, and how we can progress, evolve, and be better stewards of our town, each other, and the interests of certain folks. So it was important to the town that we make sure that we get this group back together, pick up the momentum that we had in energy and spirited conversation of last spring, and can pick it up and move it forward to resolution. I will from a personal perspective, that I'm going to continue to try to balance what is the need, which I think is a need. I think there is something to be addressed here. Balancing the need of a fair, equitable, and globally applied rational policy, but to balance that with not necessarily trying to legislate to one particular problem, which is not what we do as a town government. Because when you legislate to one problem, then that creates unintended consequences down the road, potentially, and creates something that is too finite and too contentious in some areas. So it's a fine balance. Not everybody gets everything that they need. That's life, and that's government, and that's how it works. And if you saw what Jackie and I worked through all spring or winter, what we worked through on Tuesday night for 3 hours, what we went through 2 hours last night and today, it's all about moving forward with something that is as best applied for equity and rationality, but doesn't necessarily legislate to one particular event or problem. It tries to inclusive of everybody's needs and concerns. So with that, Jack, you have anything else? That's my personal, that is not the working groups, because I respect everybody in this group. This team has different perspective. That's just how I've been trying the lens, and I've been learning from all of you. So Jackie, anything else you wanted to add?
I agree. We're doing this for the whole town. And I do want to give credit to the zoning board. That is the reason why we are started back up. I was asked that we get this back going so they can use this as a tool. And then I would just hand it over either to Tom or Mike to start us off where we left off last time.
Perfect.
Yeah. So from best memory of going through it with Mike, I believe we are on section 4, letter F of the owner occupancy requirement. In that F through H section, owner occupancy requirement, place of primary residence or accessory dwelling.
Great. Before we hit that, I think actually because there has been some, Mike, you tell me what's going on. I just want to make sure that either nothing has been finalized at a state level or introduced conversationally at the state level that may directionally change how we look at this or the lens we look at things.
Yeah, Chris, there was a proposal that was in front of the Plan and Development Committee for concerning the regulation of short-term rental properties. That particular bill was set to a public hearing and at this point has died in committee. However, we attached a copy of it. It's House Bill 1025, an act concerning short-term rental properties. Members should take a look at it because there was a kind of push towards having consumer protection step in through a licensing program with the state of Connecticut. But like I said, that particular legislation at this point, unless it rears its head in some other form, did not make it out of committee.
Okay, so we don't have any additional guardrails that potentially popped up that we need to either reframe or operate inside of.
No, but I think that legislation, as we start this group, reconstitute the group to pick up our work, it's worth taking a look at it and seeing if there's anything in that proposal that we want to incorporate in this ordinance. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Can I ask a question? I thought SB 1024 had accessory dwelling units in it as a component of it.
Mm-hmm.
SB 1024 is a different bill.
Yeah.
SB 1024 is the zoning reorg bill.
Yeah, I realized it's a different bill, but just because accessory dwelling units figure into this, I didn't know if we were going to have potentially be looking at a new ADU situation from the state down. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, from an ADU perspective, 1024 would, which is a separate bill, the zoning reorg bill, would permit accessory dwelling units up to 1,000 square feet as of right throughout communities. That bill, the zoning reorg bill, has made it out of committee. So that is something that will be showing up on either the House or the Senate's floor sooner or later with some changes. But that one, everyone has been saying it's a work in progress. So I wouldn't just assume that that's a definite go, that's going to make it to the governor's desk. The only one we could say that is definitely dead at this point would be 1025, the bill I previously referred to. But that bill also talks about the use of accessory dwelling units. So, which I think that's where we left off. Correct, Tom Fitzgerald?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, it's so to Liz. I mean, we have we were considering that concept in our ordinance, and we're recognizing that a dwelling of that type could be considered. So I think we're already acknowledging that, and I don't think that bill's consideration of accessory dwellings really would impact too much, because I think we're already addressing at least how we look at accessory dwelling relative to short-term rent ordinance. Don't you guys think that? I mean,
I just thought we defined it maybe differently than the state would end up defining it. I didn't know if there are definitions.
Oh, definition-wise.
Oh, I agree.
Okay.
Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought usage-wise. Okay, including pardon me. Good enough. Perfect. All right. So that may be.
I'm in the cheap seats. You guys do this stuff all the time.
That may be. Well, having an ordinance, right, is what allows us to be flexible. So that may be further enough down the road that we'll have to reconvene to readdress that. Is that fair enough? But we have them as part of our possible, as part of our ordinance, the use of them as a part of our ordinance. So I don't want to get too mired in that.
Well, how about it?
Yep.
Let me have a moment here.
ahead.
I've read that state bill. Unlike Mike's sense of it, that it's dead in committee or something. I looked yesterday and this bill status doesn't say it's been withdrawn, canceled, voted down. It doesn't say that. So that's just a piece of information. I'm not an expert at this, following up on state legislation, but there's no indication that it's done. But what I wanted to point out is that the strategy of that bill is they don't distinguish really ADUs and more specifically Airbnb. They talk about, it doesn't matter if the transaction to rent a short-term rental unit is directly with the owner operator or with a platform. They keep using the word platform, and the platform can be Airbnb, VRBO, and et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't matter. So they're not making some of the distinctions that we made. And I mention that only because I understand, Chris, your suggestion that we or Mike's suggestion that we ignore, to a certain extent, what the state seems to have some, interest in. But one of the things we can't do is we can't ultimately contradict whatever the state comes up with now.
Correct.
It's going to be a while before they have something settled, but
Right.
today, anything that we do that contradicts that is going to have to be revised because it won't be enforceable.
We're going to have to come back once some of these bills are settled because there are so many right now.
There's only one on the
Well, I've been
short-term
following
rental
other-
units.
Yes, I've been
short-term
following
rental
the
units.
zoning bills though, as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
So fair to say that the bill the intent, though, the spirit, a concept of what is being considered at the state level was not pushed forward to it as under somebody inquiring about short-term rentals. It was more about housing, and our accessory we define. So we may have to change what the definition of an accessory dwelling is to be in compliance with how the state ultimately may come down. I think I'm saying this correctly, but we've defined accessory dwelling in our short-term ordinance. Currently, as it's worded, has language in there that defines timeline of how often a person can rent whatever it is. So I think that guides our accessory dwelling usage down the path of short-term rentals, as we're talking about, versus housing and rental. Okay, so I think we can continue to move forward, knowing that it's in parallel somewhere at the state, that they're working on something. And if we have to change the definition of what accessory dwelling is, we most likely will. But ours has other bumpers. Our ordinance has guardrails around it just by the definition of short-term rental and how many days. In Simsbury, we're considering something could be rented in a given time. I think I'm
Correct.
Yeah,
correct.
your ordinance just references that accessory dwellings can be used. So it doesn't really matter what the definition is. You even go to the point where it doesn't have to be accessory dwelling, just a bedroom that has access.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. They may go.
I don't see what the point is.
Ron, I mean, just in case they may go so crazy as to say, well, an accessory dwelling, we're going to add that it has to have 2 chimneys versus 1, and ours doesn't. I'm saying, we may have to put something in that has a little more structure around, just because of some compliance for who knows whatever reason, accessibility. Whatever.
We can easily add to the writing accessory dwelling unit as defined by the town of Simsbury, and then when the state changes the guidance, if I don't know if it's our zoning regs or whatever, has the definition of one, then just that document could change, and then our ordinance would be fine.
Great.
You don't want to redefine these things in every document.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it could impact things like parking regulations too. So, I mean, as long as we can just go back and fix it, and I guess it's not a big deal. So, right.
Well, that's why we have an ordinance.
Yeah.
It's an ordinance is what exactly allows pliability. So picking back up where today's is, again, we're just trying to get everybody everybody's face is familiar with each other, spirit of conversation. I thought from my notes that I had made that I thought we actually had now we may not have had universal agreement, but that we had moved past the definition of Tom, of the owner and owner occupied. You said, right?
I thought so too. I just didn't think we picked what zones.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
all I think we needed to add. So, R25 or whatever they are.
Okay. So because not everybody on the call or the team is a zoning expert, it looks like algebra half the time to me. So why don't we go through what are the possibilities? Who's best to address that?
Why not? I'd say keep it simple and maybe take an approach of saying residential versus non-residential zoning districts, rather than listing everything. So then the question is, in a neighborhood, do you want the owner to be residing at the home? If so, then residential zoning districts goes into section F. Place of primary residence could be non-residential districts. So that would be anything from something that's zoned business, industrial for homes there, or it could be considered the center.
Well, let me offer another piece of, sort of perspective, and that is that I'm not sure that we can have a viable STR regulation here without designating specific zones. What we're trying to do is regulate the STR, and that just could be referred to as a dwelling or the STR licensed property. It doesn't have to identify a zone, and we don't have to make some distinction between, I guess I'm not feeling particularly warm about exempting from the requirement that they be on the premises, the owner, or more specifically, the operator of the STR. STR operator, in my mind, ought to be on the premises, whether it's, a commercial zone, one of many, and there aren't that many dwellings, I don't think, on commercial or industrial. Does it really matter?
So you want to take out you want to take out the zone?
Yeah, I don't think we need that as an issue here.
I don't have an issue, but I would need guidance on that.
Well, the state doesn't, in their draft that we're not going to, spend time on, they don't look at different zones. It's just the STR licensed dwelling. And you go from there. It's not trying to identify some different treatment in different zones, all of which might be defined differently from town to town. So they have, they have some different issues, but I guess my point, and I was looking at that last night, trying to remember, why did we fall into this discussion of making some distinction?
I think, well, no, I should say, fair question, Bruce. My recollection was we started at that as a framework because sort of the conversation was, it's just that's where we started from an outline of the conversation, because some people were talking about, well, just using an example, right? That if you're in a conventional, I got to be careful here, conventional neighborhood of character of certain type, that you would not want, there was conversation around some people not wanting somebody to come in and just buy a home, and for the purposes of specifically generating income from a short-term rental from that property and not be a residing owner there. That I think, so that was sort of how the conversation, so then it was, okay, well then, if that's your concern, do we put in specific residential zoning, do we put in regulation that says, if you're going to rent in a traditional own a piece of property in a traditional neighborhood that you rent for short-term purposes, you essentially need to be there and or be in the concept of either you have a room in your house so that somebody comes stay with you, or you have an accessory dwelling and they live in that, or you went out of town for a week and you let somebody stay and you decided to rent your home. And then it was, well, then if that property is, but maybe that's something that should be allowed in a commercial zone, if a commercial zone is in globally intended for the purpose of commerce, revenue generation of commerce, then is it possible that a person might buy a rental property? Because you can buy a rental property, right? A long-term rental property in the commercial zone and not be an owner occupant, correct? And you can rent it for long periods of time. So I think we just had we're talking about where it might be appropriate and not, just because those were some people's thoughts about where they could possibly see it being acceptable, conventionally acceptable versus not acceptable, where somebody may not have on presence ownership. So I think that's why we had it there. I personally, this is not my committee, I personally am going along your direction that I don't know that we have to define it, but but I'd like to hear from other people on the group who may have a stronger feeling the other direction. Do we feel that there is a need for, and why? There may be
my experience with Airbnb, and I've used them often, is the owner's never there. They're usually maybe smaller homes in an area that you want to be associated with, as recreational or some reason like that. I very rarely, or a large part of these Airbnbs are not people renting out a single bedroom. They are a house or whatever you're renting for a week because you want to go to that area and experience it. The owners are not there. I think that's probably 90% of them. If you want to say they have to be there, then you're just going to cut 90% of that Airbnb market is gone. Whether that's something that town wants to do, not allow it, that's, I guess, a decision to make. But that is the common use of an Airbnb facility.
Yeah, I agree. I wasn't following that we were even thinking that was realistic, that you're going to have in some sort of a short-term rental where you actually required the people to be there, other than an ADU, meaning like a separate entrance and like a separately contained unit that's attached on the same property. I don't see it's realistic that would knock out most properties from being able to do it.
Okay, then do we then?
Well, I stated Airbnbs that have the owner on the premises now. I don't have as much experience with Airbnbs as you might, Ron, so I'm not going to dispute your experience, but I think what we need to be thinking about more in terms of how this regulation is going to be administered and make it practical. And also, I'm not insensitive to there might be people who own Airbnbs, and even though they're not permitted in Simsbury, last time we counted them, Mike, you might confirm this, there were something like 17 properties being operated as some form of Airbnb.
Yep.
And
Bruce, you're dead on.
yeah, so if 2 years from now it's still only 17, I don't think we need to be too worried about that, frankly.
So Mike, I thought there was a reason that we started down this line with having owner occupied.
I think it was dealing with the nuisance complaints. So let's say someone rents the unit, house, whatever, and decides to throw a party, or there's cars everywhere, trash, etc. It was to have some sort of chain of custody as responsibility, that the homeowner or the property owner is there. You can get them on the phone. You can have an issue versus absentee. It warrants itself to kind of the black hole of communication. If something goes wrong, how do you get them out there?
You put if the owner is not in the vicinity, that they have to use a property manager that's available to answer calls within a certain radius or something? No?
I like that, Ron. I like having some kind of ownership when the owners aren't here, or accountability, because again, I would defer to Mike, but I believe most of the complaints that we received were, well, the police came out, but they couldn't do anything because the owner wasn't here.
Correct.
And this is all subject to the loss of the use of it. So it may happen, but hopefully it happens one time and then it's done. Their permit's rejected.
That's a fair point.
Yeah.
I agree having somebody you can get. I thought, I know it's been a year, but I thought we talked about that being on the application, that there would be a contact of a local contact.
We did talk about that. I'm trying to find where we put it.
I served in that capacity in Hollywood for a friend who had a house that he rented a lot. And the police never needed to contact me, but the people renting. So if he wasn't around, anywhere nearby, I was the on-call person and I got paid for
Sure.
it. That's what I
That's
did.
it. If
Perfect.
the circuit breaker tripped, you didn't know where the circuit breaker is, that kind of stuff.
Key holder.
But if you're trying to make some distinction between residential and commercial zones, I think that's a little over the top, but
I agree there, but I just think that we were people were giving, it's in there just because I think people are giving their personal possible experience of situations they may or may not have been in. And I'm like you, Bruce, I've been in both, just not direct. I've been in both where it's actually operated more like a bread and breakfast where the person was there. I went and we stayed in the person's room and they were in the home and it was a bed and breakfast essentially marketed on Airbnb. I said I Airbnb, but really bed and breakfast via Airbnb. Or we rented my family just did it. We took somebody's home over for the entire week while they were someplace else. And that kind of goes where I want to move to so do we possibly move back to the concept, or rather than legislating around zoning, do we move to the concept of the owner's participation in the property, i.e. whether this is the whole concept of primary residence or not. Okay. And I think that may address some of this versus somebody who simply buys a piece of property for the purpose of commerce through short-term rentals. And it is which I think is somewhat a concern. I don't, if you look at those 17, you're right, Bruce, who knows, maybe 2 years from now, maybe we've got 50 of these and they're, zombie landlords. But right now, I would be interested to know how many of the properties are currently owned, other than the one that sort of brought this to the forefront, where it is not somebody's residence. It is seemingly.
I can tell you of probably 3 off the top of my head, and I didn't even go through them. So I don't know that it's a lot, but I could tell you of a few that are for rental only.
most notable might be the one that, as we had a hearing that was associated with the complaints of the people of 45 Old Farms Road. And then it's 5 Gates Lane or something that's across the street that the neighbors were so,
that's what I'm saying.
And for good reason. But during the course of our hearing, a person came forward to speak to address the commission, who is the resident of a property in the Deepwood Road area that's owned by the guy who owns that house that they were all complaining about. And this other one over on Deepwood, it was one of the neighbors who came, or 2 neighbors came, to complain about his lack of oversight and poor upkeep, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, of that property on Deepwood Road. Doesn't live there. He never intended to live there. He bought it to rent as a short-term rental property. And he was apparently doing quite well at it because the occupancy rate, according to the neighbors, was consistently, it was occupied. So there's at least one that we know has not done well, that if left to be.
But wasn't the big part of that is being used for a party house? And if we set rules about a family.
No, these are 2 different locations owned by the same character.
So that was somebody who was in there long term, but the landlord wasn't any good still?
No, he was using it as a short-term rental over on Deepwood Road.
Okay, but it wasn't, they weren't.
He lived on Old Farms.
Would those complaints have triggered the removal of his permit?
Correct.
Yes.
Yep.
If we had a permit.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
so that's so just stop, just if I can ask.
Or he could have corrected
right
it.
there. You've brought something forward that's important, and that is that we, in our ordinance, we have started to identify that you cannot assume or rent a short-term residence. You can't rent anything for the purpose of having an event, of any kind of event, specifically for that. So that's for a party. So that's in there now, right? So if a person did that, then they would be in violation, then they would lose their permit, correct?
Yep.
Okay. We've added in that I don't know what else we added. One other thing in there that was around, that would be sort of if you did this, it'd be a violation of your permit for well, I guess it is the fact that it's in violation of a number of things and you lose your permitting to operate that as a short-term residence going forward. Noise, something else. So I think that what brought these forward, we're starting to chip away at some of the issues that highlighted the need that brought this all to our attention, that some properties were being used for certain purposes. And I think we've started to address those. So we are addressing some of the concerns of the town, the residents, around the improper use or the unintended use as what would be the spirit of a property. So if we go to the concept of owner, I think if a person wants to purchase an investment property in town, they can do that. There's plenty of homes that are for rent for long-term purposes where you don't need to be owner occupant, right? And I think
that's a different market though. The long-term market rental is completely different than the short-term.
Correct. But I think and
there's no regulation of it now.
Yeah.
Nope.
The only thing that I've read across the nation, people complaining about these short-term rentals and people buying properties for it are usually in the high tourist areas where people are going in and they're buying so many of these properties that they're pushing out the locals and they're using them for short-term rentals. I don't know if Simsbury is ever going to have that issue to, like in Telluride, they were complaining about it in Colorado. There was an article, this Wall Street Journal this weekend about Barcelona having a huge problem with the residents are moving out of the city because it's being used, all their apartments are being used for short-term rentals. But I don't know if that's something we have to address.
Ron, what I'm not saying eloquently is I'm trying to think of, when you go back to the whole concept of neighborhoods and what people expect and not expect, that kind of thing. I appreciate us having to put a short-term rental ordinance in that allows Liz Peterson to go on vacation and put her property into a commercial use perspective for ancillary purposes. I'm trying to balance that with a person who specifically is buying a piece of property for the purpose of a commercial operation. And that's I think that allowing citizen property owners, homeowners, occupant homeowners, the flexibility to, through the proper permitting process, proper inspection process, proper regulation and respect process, allowing them to use their property for put a little bit of extra cash in their pocket is okay. That's okay, but I think that I'm comfortable putting restriction around somebody who buys a home for the purpose of a commercial operation. Because if they want a commercial operation, then buy it as a rental property for long-term purposes, and it's wide open.
So again, that's a different
same amount of
market.
money. It's not the same amount of money either. You're going to make more money on short, depending on the market you're in, maybe not.
Right. I'm trying to balance the concept of neighborhood with commercial operation.
With income.
Right. And I don't know how realistic, you think about it. If you going to be gone for the weekend, are you going to put all your stuff away for some stranger to come into your house for the weekend?
Believe me, some people do.
Yeah. Some people do, Ron.
Well, when I lived in
you really have to be committed to that.
Well, I lived in a tourist area. I lived in Redondo Beach, California, where neighbors did do that because it was worth it for them.
Yeah.
Right.
So I have that, the impact of living in a place like that with that happening. So I
guess you got to say, is there any value to having people buy a property for that purpose? And they say, well, I want to use it for rental, and the long-term rental market isn't that viable, but I can rent this out short-term. And if I get 20 weeks or 20, 50, whatever, 30 weekends, I'll cover my nut on it. And it's a lot better deal than trying to rent it out for a year, because you look at the rates are tremendous. Is there a benefit to the town to having those kind of facilities available? It's kind of a competition with the hotel market.
Yeah.
What are the detriments to it? I mean, if you have in the ordinance that the bad behavior means you're going to be rejected from your permit, yeah, that might pop up. But if they're acted swiftly and people are booted off, then they'll realize it, and that should stop it.
That's what we're trying to do is create this permit so that it can be just the ones that are not following and that are not keeping with the neighborhood, with, you just not being a disruptor.
So can I offer a writing suggestion for it? Is you can combine the two sections F and G by putting something like a property should be a place of primary residence at least, or it can be owner occupied. Kind of work that language in there so that it has to at least be their primary residence, which we defined earlier as them being in town for X amount of days. But it can also be owner occupied. And then you kind of get rid of two paragraphs into one.
And add in there that if the owner is not in town during the
a local contact,
there must be a I don't have to go to say resident, but there's a person must be either on property or in town that is the custodian, property manager, whatever you want to be put of the property that can be essentially on site. I have to say, as quick as the police can be on site, that person is on site, essentially, because that's what we have. Not that's going to be relative to an infraction, but if there is an emergent situation where that person has a problem, that renter has a problem, or the neighbor has a problem. Would somebody agree? Others agree to that? If we don't say that
yeah, and they should have some kind of authority vested by the property owner. Otherwise, they could just say, "Sorry, I'll have to get to the property owner, and I can't do it for you."
If they're on their boat outside of cell service.
Is there any way we could add something that would allow the children of the owner? I know I've brought this up before, but I just feel like, an inherited situation where it's not your primary residence, but say it was your parents and they died. And, I think, if it's still the family, it may be too awkward to word, but say it's a family home and they want to keep it. Maybe the siblings would like to keep their family home in Simsbury. No one lives there anymore. I just think it's really harsh to not allow them to do this. And, maybe it's not a huge issue, but to me, it seems like a reasonable ask.
I think that goes back to the fact whether the owner has to be a resident of that property or or primary dwelling. If you take that away, that they don't have to be, then you can have that situation.
Could you have or inherited or some wording that, the chain that figures that into it?
I think that gets, like you said, kind of tricky to word that. And
well, what the state draft that, again, I realize it's not really something we want to spend a lot of time on, but they distinguish between the owner and the operator. And the operator is the name on the permit. And then the owner has a bunch of scenarios, and the definition of what an owner is. But you don't have to be an owner to be the signer of the permit. You have to be the operator.
Couldn't the owner be an entity too?
Yes. Yeah, that's the picture the state has. And
but again, to me, Bruce, that's getting towards like a tourist situation, right? That's getting towards you're the owner, but I've turned over my property to a property manager because I intend this property to be a commercial endeavor.
But if the operator has to be in residence when the STR is occupied, do you really care if it's, I mean, yeah, there's a distinction to be made, whether it's the owner or a commercial, relationship that puts the person in that place, as long as they're on premises.
Yeah, but I think we're gonna run afoul there where there is a ton of, if I hear you correctly, whether it's the owner or let's say it's a property manager, let's just say take two simple, that no matter who it is, they've got to be on property when there's a person living in that house. That kind of goes away from, and that's okay. I'm just mapping this out. That goes away from the concept of Liz going on vacation for a week and putting her home up for Airbnb for just that week, right? That she's gone now. She's no longer on site.
That's affirmative. Yeah.
What if the owner's a trust?
Same thing. You got to have an operator. A trust can't be the operator.
We went into this last time and right, Tom, we made it more specific to, it's not about the owner, it's the permit.
Yeah, we put back on the application permit that a list of all owners and primary residences of the property and their contact information.
So I think we're talking about two concepts that are separate, but both very onerous. Mm-hmm. They're pretty heavy-handed. I'm not saying that they're not worth it, but if you think they're pretty heavy, one is this has to be your primary residence. That's a pretty heavy consideration. And the other one is somebody's got to be there at all times, whether it's the owner or it's an operator or their designee. I mean, we obviously can't we put both of them in there. This thing's going to be way too defined. The person has to not only be their primary residence, but they have to be there exactly at the same time. So it's like I don't think we can do both. I don't think you can do both together. And even each of them individually is pretty heavy, and I don't know which way to go with that. I would think the other people may agree with me or not, but
yeah, I can work on combining them and then adding in that local contact, so then you guys can review that wording at the next meeting, and then we can kind of come back. That way, it gives people more time to think about anything as well. That way, for the rest of this meeting, we can kind of move on to other sections too, if you wanted to.
That would be really helpful.
Okay,
Tom.
let's go.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I know we want to move on, but Liz's the concept is, I think, real. You do get a property handed, if you inherit a piece of property, and I think it's real, but I don't know how practical in likelihood it is. I mean, they say, hey, we inherited this home. We inherited this beautiful home on Hot Meadow Street. We want to rent it to be able to keep it before we dispose of it. But I don't know how practical it is relative to, how many people are going to be in that situation. So
I think if you just left that as the same as a property that was never occupied by the owner, but was intended just for short-term rentals or long-term rentals or whatever that property owner could make of it, whether they inherited it or they bought it. Trying to make that distinction. I don't know if it really exists. Someone who inherited property could be just as bad an actor as a person that buys property.
Worse.
Well, also, we've already put that as a primary residence. So like you're saying, if they inherited it, it would still be their primary residence.
Not if they don't live there.
Not if they already live someplace else.
Say so parents die, 3 kids, Colorado, California, Florida. They want to keep the family home that they don't live in because their parents died, but they've inherited it.
So then they wouldn't be able to rent it for short term. They could do long-term rental.
Well,
we defined that already.
Yeah, Mike, maybe I could help you out here, because the fact is, this thing refers to, we're talking about a 29-day rental, up to 29 days. What we're going to regulate. The state's going to regulate up to 30 days. But the point is that, anybody who's, wants to make something work, like the out-of-state, the the offspring who inherited a house. All they have to do is write a deal that's, say 2 months, a 60-day deal that doesn't have any penalty for early departure and then also provides for rollover at the end of 60 days, some language about rollover, then that's not regulated at all. Not at all.
All the animals.
Well, I've been thinking about this since I'm face to
It's a good
face
one.
with some very, very angry residents of Simsbury who to this day, I don't think are less angry than they were back then.
But are you advocating we put a cheat sheet in here, Bruce, for tell people how to figure out?
No, but I want, as we agonize over some of this, that you have to understand that, somebody who wants to get around it's going to be able to find ways to do that.
They'll figure it out.
Yeah, I also think that some of the folks you're talking about, okay, we came with a problem, right? Again, I told you not going to legislate to a specific property. We are somewhat removing some of the, I think we are putting in things that are removing the ability for that to occur at someone else's property to someone else, let alone that property.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we are progressing down.
Oh, Chris, I don't want to be misunderstood here. I don't think everybody's going to be happy with whatever we come up with. We can't make everyone happy. That's
a compromise.
Yeah.
So
but we
Chris,
can move this thing along.
well, in essence of time, we're 8 minutes to 9 o'clock. I don't know if we want to go into next step, meeting dates, approval of minutes. I don't know if we have time to.
Well, we've already have a meeting on the calendar.
Yep.
We do.
April 26th at 8 a.m.
Yeah. And we'll try not to rehash owner versus owner occupied at that meeting. And I don't know that the minutes, we can say, is any of a problem with the minutes in 2 minutes. But just what is the next sort of chunky issue in the ordinance that we have to tackle? That's going to create drama amongst us.
Could I ask a question?
Probably the conduct
I didn't realize that
section.
we had put the permit authorization into zoning. I thought that you didn't want to do that because that would follow the property as opposed to following the person.
That's right.
But I think that's how I read this, right?
This process was to be owned by the Board of Selectmen and delegated to the town manager or something. Right. It's not a zoning issue.
But that's how it reads.
Where are you, Ron?
Where it said the permit will be issued by, right?
Yep. The permit would be by the planning and building staff, just because they do all other permits.
Oh, staff. Okay.
Yeah. Not the planning board.
Okay. My bad.
Yeah. That's, I think we're fine.
Okay.
Yeah. I think the next section might be kind of those general standards, conduct and enforcement is probably the next chunky section.
Okay.
Which is section 7, if my Roman numeral reading is correct.
Yep. See, occupancy, safety. That's all in line with just building permit stuff we agreed to.
Yep.
So it just come down to the conduct.
What about notification of neighbors? Does that fall under that?
It's in there.
Yeah, so it's in there. It's in there, but
that.
Mike and I, my note from our last meeting is Mike and I have to work to create language for that.
We were going to tweak kind of what's there. It's kind of a placeholder.
Yeah. It's section 4.
Yep. E on page 2.
Subsection E.
It's interesting.
And then it goes to page 3.
Yeah, it's interesting, Bruce. This is the opposite of what we opened up our offline conversation about how it works.
Right.
Yeah. So
I see it.
So should we actually? So we're sequential then. Should we put that as a focus of possibly next meeting?
Yeah, Mike and I can work to have language drafted for next meeting.
Okay.
For the neighbor?
Yep.
Notification. I'm saying sequentially rather than working back and forth in the document, unless it's an issue of reference back and forth. Let's keep it sequential.
Does everybody understand where I'm coming from on that? That based on my personal experience with law enforcement being called because people didn't know what was happening, that a lot of the disruption could have been minimized if the neighbors knew that they were renters, short-term renters. So.
Definitely.
I've got no problem. I mean,
Okay, I'm just
got,
saying, as far as the language goes, I would say somebody visually impacted. You know, as far as if you're trying to do like a foot zone, that was what I was. You know, who might be a neighbor who would be impacted, and I know, you know, distance from the property or whatever type of thing.
Listen, I've got no problem with that being a requirement because, again, I think we talked about this last time. You know, you one day you drive up to your home, and then the next day you drive up and there's some weird cars in the driveway, and you don't know why that happened. And it's every day it's a different one. You'd like to know it. I think that's just we've all had a graduation party or some kind of thing where we put a flyer in somebody's mailbox. Hey, just want to let you know Saturday. Gonna be lots of cars on the street because we're having a party. You're welcome to come, or we're having whatever it is. It's the same thing, right? It's courtesy, and it serves a purpose. So notification definitely should be part of the process.
Yeah.
Well, let me just add to what you said, Chris, because you didn't stop with putting them in the mailbox with your next door neighbor. You went down the street further. And my point is, I don't know where the 100-foot limit came from in that item where we're talking about.
Is that the noise? Is that the noise one?
No,
I think 100 feet.
He's on top of page 2 after the neighbor notification E.
I'm looking at under expiration and renewal process.
Yeah, I think it should be more than 100 feet.
100 feet is like,
that you might not even leave your yard at that point, depending on where you are.
I think Tom just said this was just a placeholder.
Okay. I was just kind of throwing it out there to explain where I was coming from.
That's fine with me. It's a placeholder, but it needs more attention.
Because there is a reference to, property line and decibel. I thought you were talking about that one. Okay, no.
That's different.
Yeah.
That's in conduct.
All right. So that's just, so you guys will come back with a more, I'm not going to say reasonable or logical. All right. But you guys are reacting to that. All right. 8:58. So let's just move to the minutes. Any comments?
Chris, I'll move approval of the minutes as they were submitted.
Thank you, sir. So we'll assume those seconded and approved. Thank you.
Second.
Great. And does anybody have a problem with the 26th today?
I'm going to be in Florida. I'm not sure if I'll be able to participate.
Make sure you're illegal. Make sure you've pulled the correct permits and are staying the illegal property.
Ron, if you have any comments or anything.
Well, I'm going to be in Boulder, Colorado, but I might be in a B&B, so an Airbnb. So
all right. Well,
maybe I'll have a little more insight.
Okay. Well, then can both of you make it or not?
Yes, I'm a yes.
Ron, if you have any comments, I would just say email, you know what I mean, or get in touch.
Ron, you can, if you have any on the sections that we're talking about, you can send me like an email of all your thoughts. And then we can either distribute that in the packet or to the group members before the meeting.
Okay.
In case you can't make the meeting.
Okay.
The meeting's being videoed, right?
Yeah.
So you can watch it, the day after, whenever it's convenient on.
Yeah, you'll be the only person.
SCTV.
I might be fishing that morning though.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is anybody missing today? I thought Holly.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that the only person?
Yeah, we waited for. Listen, that's why I'm kind of sensitive here. I'm not trying to push things through, but our group is so small. And then we have loud voices. I'm trying to make sure that we, as opposed to something like the Board of Selectmen, which can have a missing wheel, every once in a while, because there's so many meetings going forward. This group, I'm trying to be cognizant of having everybody there and not have too many people missing.
I feel like she was only at the first meeting we ever had, though. Am I wrong about that? I'm just wondering if we need to accommodate that better.
It was at one of them. I sent an email, and I know people in our office have sent emails, so we can kind of work to make sure that we can kind of get her onto the next meeting.
Or maybe somebody could replace her from, who is she representing?
The Planning Commission.
Planning.
We could certainly, if that comes down, Tom, we could talk to Bill Rice if we need to. It's a good idea.
That's a good compromise. Okay. So unless anybody has a real problem with the 26th and they really feel like I'm respectful. If you can't make it and you really want to be at the meeting live, I am amenable to moving a meeting around potentially, because I don't want anybody not to feel like that they're getting the bum rush through this or whichever. So, but we'll hold it as the 26th, and I appreciate everybody's participation, and we'll talk then. Thanks, Tom, Mike.
Thank you,
Talk to you
Tom.
guys.
Thanks, Mike.
Okay.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you.
See you
Have a
guys.
good
day.
morning,
Bye
everyone.
now.
Okay,
Ciao.
bye.